Now it's up to me. Okay, my name is Mike Gleason, and I'm in Bangor, Maine, but it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Leonard Dallison. Robert Dallison attended both the Royal Roads Military College and the Royal Military College of Canada, and following graduation in 1958, was commissioned into the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, at the time headquartered in Winnipeg. He served for 35 years with the Canadian Army, obtaining the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and ending his career as Chief of Staff of the Combat Arms School at the Canadian Forces Base in Gagetown, New Brunswick. Bob received a BA in History from the Royal Military College and a BA in History and International Studies from the University of British Columbia. After retiring, he maintained his lifelong interest in history and heritage, including serving as the president of the Fredericton Heritage Trust and the New Brunswick representative on the Board of Governors for Heritage Canada. From 1992 to 2002, he was director of King's Landing Historical Settlement in Prince William, New Brunswick. He is also the author of Hope Restored, The American Revolution and the Founding of New Brunswick, and A Neighborly War, New Brunswick and the War of 1812. And it is with great pleasure that I now turn this over to Robert Dallison.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate your comments. Turning back to Fenians, what in earth is a Fenian? If you don't know, you're not alone, may I say. The Fenians are found on that long, rocky, very volatile history of finding Irish independence. They are, in fact, predecessors of the current IRA. They are basically a revolutionary group, one of many, on the finding of independence for Ireland. To understand the story of the Fenians, we have to go back one revolution. We go back to the year of 1848, when there was a revolution called the Young Irish. This revolution was crushed by the British authorities before it even began, but the Fenians had either were arrested or fled. Our story tonight deals with two men who fled this particular revolution. The first one is James Stevenson. Stevens fled to Paris. Paris at this particular time was a center of unrest and revolution. You wanted to learn to be a revolutionary, good place to go. 10 years later, in 1858, you find Stevens back in Dublin. In Dublin, he founded an organization which he called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And he made it quite clear, the goal of this brotherhood was the freedom of Ireland through the use of violence. His timing was extremely good. In Ireland at this time, there was a depression. There was a lot of unemployed people and dissatisfied people in Ireland. And very quickly, he put together a group. He had raised a substantial war chest. He gathered arms. He set up a newspaper. And if the newspapers of the day are correct, there were hundreds and hundreds of Irishmen drilling at night secretly, waiting for the day when Stevenson would say, "Rise up." The second man I'd like to talk about is John O Mahoney. Mahoney, when he fled to New York City. Once again, his timing was very good. He set up a group which he called the Fenian Brotherhood. And the goal of this particular group was to support Stevens in his revolution in Ireland. Once again, timing was very good. He raised a war chest of $250,000. In this day and age, that was a substantial amount of money. He too had people training and drilling But in the United States, they did it in the open on Sunday afternoon as a bit of a sport. The British authorities watched both these groups very, very carefully. By 1865, if the newspapers are correct, 100,000 Irishmen in North America and in Ireland were just waiting for the word to rise up. The British authorities watched it very carefully. And it came to a head in the fall of 1865 when the Royal Navy arrested an American ship on the west coast of Ireland with the poignant name of Erin's Hope. It was chock-a-block full of men, arms, and ammunition ready to support Stevens. The British decided it was time to act. September 1865, they suspended the habeas corpus, arrested every Fenian that they could find in the town, closed down their newspaper, seized their money and all their arms, and then spent the rest of the time searching Ireland from one end to the other without the benefit of any law, looking for rebels. Stevens' revolution was over before it even started. I guess I could end the talk here, couldn't I? But what we'll do is we'll follow John O Mahoney's group. He's now in North America, and his goal, if you remember, was to support Stevens. Well, there's nobody to support now. So in October 1865, he called a convention in Philadelphia. 600 delegates came from across the United States, and if the newspapers here are correct, including a delegation from St. John, New Brunswick. The purpose of this meeting was one thing: what should O Mahoney and the Fenian Brotherhood do now? They had nobody to support in Ireland. What should they do? And it broke down into a very violent discussion into two groups. First, there was John Mahoney's group. He took a very conservative approach. He said every few years there was always another revolution in Ireland. All they had to do is sit by and wait for the next revolution to come along, and then they would do what they had originally intended to do, to support revolution in Ireland. His opponent was a man by the name of William Roberts, and his group, got the name of Men of Action. They decided they could not sit on their hands and do nothing while the Irish people were suffering. They were being exploited by that terrible tyrant of Britain. They had to do something, and they had to do it now. It certainly caught the ear of many of the people at this delegation. So much so that they attracted a very famous Union general. The Union War was over at this time, so he had nothing to do, by the name of Fighting Joe Sweeney. And Fighting Joe Sweeney was tasked with raising, arming, training, and preparing for an invasion of British North America. They came up with this idea, and it helps if you're a little bit Irish to understand it, but they came up with this idea of invading the colonies of British North America, holding them hostage for exchange for Irish independence. The meeting in Philadelphia broke up with two distinctive groups, both hostile to one another and quite separate: O Mahoney's group and Roberts' group. Tonight, I'll talk about what happened with O Mahoney's Fenian group. On the 17th of March, 1866, O Mahoney, as all Irishmen did, gathered for St. Patrick's Day. And at this meeting, one of O Mahoney's senior assistants, a man by the name of Bernard Doran Kilian, stood on his hind legs and said, "Boys, if we do nothing, our group is just going to simply fade away. because Robert's group has got all the attention. He's doing things and preparing to do some action. And so all the public support and interest has gone to his group. If we continue to do nothing, our Fenian Brotherhood will just simply disappear. And he came forward with an idea, not as ambitious as the Men of Action's idea, but he came up with the idea of invading, occupying Campobello Island. I don't know how many people at this particular meeting knew where Campobello Island was, but his idea was that they would occupy Campobello Island and declare it a separate, independent Irish republic. And in this separate Irish republic, they could raise an Irish army prepared to invade Ireland. They could also raise an Irish navy, and the navy would prey on the British merchant marine, and that's how they were going to finance their revolution. He selected Campobello Island because he said it was the right size. It was big enough to train and arm an army. It was small enough that it was easy to protect. It was isolated, so it'd be hard for the British military to get at it. It was close enough to Maine so you could still have your contacts back and forth. And it was in New Brunswick. New Brunswick, 1/4 of our population was Irish descent. And surely anybody with Irish blood would only want to help them. And finally, New Brunswick was defenseless. We had absolutely no army. And it would be an easy walk to capture Campobello Island. The idea was very well received at this meeting, and the Fenians decided immediately to undertake to capture Campobello Island. Now, you can't raise a private army in the United States to invade a foreign country. It's against several of their laws, in fact. So they needed a cover story. And they came up with the idea of saying, we are going to hold a convention at a place called Eastport, Maine. And so immediately all the Fenians in groups and bunches of 2 or 3 made their way to Eastport on foot, by stagecoach, by boat, on horseback. And gradually they just began to filter into Eastport. At the same time, they contracted a ship called the Ocean Spray, and they filled the Ocean Spray full of arms and ammunition and all the supplies necessary for a war. And it set sail for Eastport. On the 10th of April, 1866, Kilian, now known as General Kilian, arrived at Eastport, Maine. He rented the Triscott Hall as a convention center, supposedly, but also for his headquarters. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of restless Fenians hanging around Eastport with nothing to do. And they looked across from Eastport, across the bay, and there they saw an island known as Indian Island. Pam? And Indian Island's a small island tucked between Deer Island and Campobello Island. You hardly notice it today. There's only 1 or 2 summer cottages on it or summer places on it. But in this day, Indian Island had a permanent population, a customs house, bonded warehouses, and a school. And on the custom warehouse, there was a large flagpole flying the Union Jack. And when the Fenians looked over from Eastport, seeing this Union Jack, everything that they despised, they decided to do something about it. That night, they got in a boat, rowed over to Eastport, Indian Island, and surrounded the custom house and began to tear off the shutters and break down the doors. And the family inside, Dixon was the custom agent, were terrorized. The Fenians demanded the Union Jack, and they got it. They took the Union back to Eastport, paraded it around the town, claiming it to be a war trophy captured under the eyes of the British Navy. It then went to New York, where it was paraded around as a war trophy. So what was happening now in New Brunswick at this particular time? So I'll pause and talk about New Brunswick now. Kilian, when he stood on his hind legs, said New Brunswick was defenseless. He was almost right. His timing was a little off. From the time that the border between Maine and New Brunswick had been settled in 1842, the Ashburn-Webster Treaty, we had a very peaceful, friendly relationship with Maine. Very close, very good trade, people going back and forth. And New Brunswick had absolutely nothing to fear from anybody in the world. We had no enemies. And our politicians, like politicians are wont to do, decided, why are we wasting money on defense? And they disbanded the militia and spent no money on defense, deciding to spend money on roads, schools, and lining politicians' pockets. So for 20 years, we had a very peaceful relationship. We had no defense. And so Kilian was right. But then something happened. It's called the American Civil War. Not yet, Pam.
Oh, sorry.
The American Civil War, the relationship between the British Empire and the United States was very hostile. We came very, very close to war on several occasions, mainly because we, the British Empire, and that includes New Brunswick, of course, declared neutrality. In neutrality, we treated both the Union and the Confederacy as equals. That did not please the Northerners, because they did not consider the Confederacy as an equal state. And so that caused a lot of heartburn with the way we were treating them. In addition, you had to remember that Great Britain at this time was a great textile manufacturer, and you can't grow cotton in England. Where do you get cotton? The Confederacy. And so this trade that we wanted to continue also caused heartburn for the Northerners. And our attitude, in fact, with many New Brunswickers were pro-Confederacy. As a result, there was considerable tension along our border. As I mentioned, on at least 2 occasions, we came within the nace of a war. There was the Chesapeake Affair and the Trent Affair. In fact, in the Trent Affair, it came so close to war that Britain reinforced their garrison in North America by 11,000 soldiers. It was only Lincoln who finally put this problem to rest using some common sense. He pointed out to his fellow politicians that they were already fighting a war with the Confederacy and not doing very well. Why on earth would you want to have another war with Great Britain? But still, there was that hostile feeling. To boil it all down, New Brunswick decided it was time that we turned our attention to some defensive measures. At the same time, another thing happened. In October 1861, we got ourselves a new lieutenant governor. And this new lieutenant governor was Arthur Hamilton Gordon, the first Lord of Stanmore. He was a Scottish aristocrat. He was a bachelor, and he was a man who liked to do things. And when he got to New Brunswick, he found out that we had responsible government, and his role was very minimal, only ceremonial. He needed something to do. It turned out that he had one area of responsibility was totally his, with no interference by politicians, and that was defense. And he turned his whole interest to the defense of New Brunswick. He started off by designing a new militia act, the Militia Act of 1861. This took in a whole bunch of new modern ideas. Once again, it still had the result that every male in New Brunswick had to be in the militia from the age of 15 to 65. But that was such a large number, it would be impossible to train them to any high standard or no money to support them. So he divided the militia into 3 groups, Class A, Class B, and Class C. And he concentrated on Class A militia group. To be in the Class A militia, you had to volunteer, you were unemployed, you had to pay for your own uniform. The government, however, provided you with arms, ammunition, drill halls, and most important, regular soldiers to train you. Quite enthusiastic group of people joined this Class A militia, so that by the time the Fenians came around, or by the time Kilian stood on his hind legs and said we were defenseless, in fact, the Class A had 2,100, a well-trained, well-equipped, well-organized militia. So we weren't totally defensive. In addition, we also had, may I have the next slide, Pam? And here's an example of the Class A militia. This one in St. Andrews, they had 2 Class A groups, an artillery outfit, which is on the left of this slide, and an infantry outfit known as the Gordon Rifles on the right. We also had a regular force British soldiers here. Next slide, please, Pam. Oh, I'm sorry. This is an example of 2 of the volunteers in the Class A militia from St. John. I like their hats. And we also had, the next slide, please, regular forest troops. And here in New Brunswick, we had the 15th Regiment. It was stationed mainly in St. John and Fredericton. And this is an example of the company stationed in St. John. So once again, when Kilian actually stood on his feet and said we were defensive, he wasn't quite right. We had the Class A, 2,100 men, and we had the British regulars, this battalion, and a group of British artillery soldiers. So when the Fenian crisis began, Gordon, who was responsible for defense in our province, said that he thought he could handle it with it. But as the Fenians began to muster into Eastport, we could see them gathering. And in fact, from Deer Island, they could see the Fenians training and drilling near Dog Island in Eastport. And they could see them drilling by Robinson. Things began to heat up a little bit. And Gordon wondered, now, did he have enough troops? And he began to worry about the Fenians raiding across the border. He felt they couldn't, at this particular stage, mount an invasion, but they can certainly raid across the border on the frontier things. And that was a favorite pastime for Americans during the American Civil War, raiding one another. You ran across the border, destroyed government property, stole arms, robbed banks, which was a favorite thing, and then go back across the border. So he was worried about this happening in New Brunswick, and he decided he needed to do something about it. And he came up with a new idea. He decided to form what he called home guards. And a home guard was a man who volunteered his time, unpaid, willing to train 1 day a week. He had instructors, and the government would provide them with arms and ammunition and instructors on how to use their arms. And they were given one task and one task only, and that was the defense of their own community. Gordon went around all the frontier villages and towns selling this idea, and it was willingly accepted. And before you know it, there was home guards all along our frontier. I think, Pam, next is the map. This is the map I don't expect you to see all the detail, but every one of those flags represents a military outfit here in New Brunswick. Just look at the number of them. It's really quite surprising how well defended we were. So now when the Fenians were beginning to get numbers in Eastport and along the main frontier, New Brunswick was no longer defenseless. On the 21st of April, 1866, the Ocean Spray, remember the Ocean Spray, the boat that had left New York full of arms and arrived in Eastport. The customs agent, a man by the name of Long, arrested the ship and seized the cargo. He then applied for advice from a superior in Portland. The superior in Portland gave it some thought, and he said, "You have no right to arrest this ship because it's an American, a registered American vessel carrying cargo from American port to another American port. Unless Long had some kind of reason to believe that the cargo was going to some foreign country, he had no right to arrest it." Before this happened, the United States government had decided it was time that they take some steps because they began worrying about their neutrality. And they did two things. The first thing is they put together a squadron of 5 warships and posted it to Eastport. The second thing they did, they went to the most senior American soldier in Washington, and his name was Major General George Meade. Oh, I'm sorry, Pam. Yeah, and they tasked Meade to go to Eastport and ensure that neutrality rules were not being broken. So when Long got this warning that he could not arrest the ship, it just so happened the USS Winooski, Pam, back up, there you go, arrived in port. That was one of the ships in the 5 ships being sent to Eastport. And the captain of this ship took action. He arrested the ship and seized the cargo, and then applied for advice from the Secretary of State in Washington. That really put the Washington government into a real state because they wanted to maintain their neutrality, but there was a congressional election coming up. And the Irish vote was extremely important in places like Boston and Washington and New York. So they weren't quite sure what to do. So they dithered a bit. The next day, up shows General Meade. Meade, being an old soldier, knew exactly what to do. He seized the cargo of the Ocean Osprey and moved it for security reasons to Fort Sullivan. During this move, they realized that some of the cases of arms were missing, including cases of arms that contained the most modern rifle of the time, the 7-shot Spencer, the first successful repeating rifle that had been put to great use at Gettysburg, at the Devil's Glen in Wheatfield, for those who are familiar with that battle. And this put fear into the British Army, of course, because they were still busy using muskets that were muzzle loaded. So a repeating rifle would be a real asset on a battlefield. Meantime, there was all kinds of activity amongst the Fenians who were waiting on the main side of the border, all kinds of interesting incidents. One of them was, for example, there was in Calais, a group of Fenians were formed there. A circle was formed there under the leadership of a man by the name of Dennis Doyle. He got a couple loads of armed Fenians, went across the St. Croix River, landed just south of St. Andrews, and he was detected by one of the residents, a man with the interesting name of Old Joe Young. He hopped on his horse and raced it up the road towards St. Andrews, shouting, "The Fenians are upon us, run to the hills." And the people abandoned their houses and went into the woods. That's how terrified New Brunswickers were. Doyle fired a few muskets in the air, set fire to a couple wood piles, and went back to Calais for a snort or two. It's sort of funny, but I think the point that I like to make is New Brunswickers were really uptight about their safety for themselves and their families. Once again, Gordon sat down and did an assessment of what was the situation at that particular time. And he came to the conclusion that the Fenians were now capable of a full-fledged invasion. And he needed help. Where did he turn for help? Well, New Brunswick was part of the British Empire, and the British Empire had responsibility for defense. So Gordon turned to the imperial authorities and asked for some help. He asked that a warship, a British warship, be stationed in the St. Croix River. He asked that some British regular force soldiers, 50 to 100, one or two companies worth, be stationed in St. Andrews and St. Stephen. The imperial government reacted as we would have hoped they would, promptly and officially and without any fuss. The first people to respond was the Royal Navy. At this time, the Royal Navy had a squadron on this side of the ocean, which they called the North American and Caribbean Squadron. The Navy is not dumb. In wintertime, when it's bloody cold in Canada, the squadron was stationed in Jamaica. In the summer, when it was a hurricane time in Jamaica, they were stationed in Halifax. When this plea for help came, it just so happened that the squadron was moving from Jamaica to Halifax. Within days, 2 British warships were stationed in the St. Croix River. One opposite Campobello near Friar's Head, and one opposite Navy Island by St. Andrews. Within 2 weeks, there were 6 British warships in the Fundy area. That meant that it put paid to anything that the Fenians wanted to do, like invading St. John by sea or invading Campobello by ship. The man in charge of the Navy at this time was a most interesting cat. He was a Vice Admiral, Sir James Hope, an experienced naval officer. He had lots of combat under his collar. And in fact, he led an attack on Chinese fort in the Second Opium War. Tremendous casualties. He not only lost a leg, but he lost his hip and his leg. But that didn't seem to hinder his career any. He knew all about gunboat diplomacy, and he decided to do something which, if you remember, Gordon asked for 1 ship. He sent 6. One of the ships that he sent was his flagship, HMS Duncan. I think that's the next slide. There you are. It was a magnificent ship. It was only 5 years old at this time. It was 242 feet long. It had 5,700 tonnage. It carried 81 cannons. Some of the cannons were the most modern of the time. They were called Armstrong cannons. They were rifled, breech-loading cannons. And one of the cannons aboard this ship could fire a shell 110 pounds. The crew, officers, sailors, and Marines were 1,000 men, something to behold. Hope sailed that ship right along the international border and parked it right opposite Eastport, where everybody in Eastport, including the Fenians, had a bloody good view of this ship. To make sure they understood it, they had an opening day. And they invited anybody who was anybody on either side of the border, particularly journalists, to this ship on opening day. The Navy put on a great dog and pony show, displaying all kinds of naval skills and gun drills. They had booze, they had bands, and they had good food, and they had booze. The result of this was tremendous reporting in the newspaper, the wonder of this ship and the power of this ship. It was all done for one reason, of course, to influence the Fenians. The British Army also reacted quickly. The senior man in this part of the country was Sir Charles Doyle. He was an Irishman by birth, an experienced officer, a veteran of the Crimea War. He had under command 3,500 soldiers. He immediately got on a ship and came to New Brunswick for an inspection to see for himself what was going on. He arrived, he quickly realized that the guns protecting St. John were obsolete. They only had 10 rounds, hardly enough to fight any battle with. And within 10 days, he had organized a ship, a schooner called Juliet. It was loaded with modern heavy artillery, ammunition, and 400 barrels of powder. When he arrived, the regiment that was stationed here, the 15th Regiment, was in the process of being rotated to Bermuda. He halted that rotation on his own hook, on his own authority, and then informed London what he had done. And it meant that within 2 weeks, when the replacement for the 15th arrived, the infantry strength in New Brunswick, British infantry strength, had doubled. He did the same thing in Halifax. He canceled the rotation there and doubled the infantry there. He did a number of really good things, and then he conferred with Gordon to decide how they were going to defend New Brunswick against this possible invasion by the Fenians. He and Gordon disagreed. Gordon wanted defense. Remember, he had asked for 50 or 100 soldiers right on the frontier with St. Andrew, St. Stephen. Gordon disagreed with penny packeting his soldiers around the frontier. What the military strategy at the time was that you'd hold your forces in a concentrated area in the center of the area of conflict and waited for the enemy to invade, so you'd know where they're coming and how strong they were, and then you attack them in the flank. They agreed to disagree. Gordon persisted in wanting troops on the frontier. Doyle was smart enough to realize that in a democracy, the military is subordinate to the civil authority. And finally, he said to Gordon, "I will do what you requested, but I will do it my way." He said, "I will embark troops in Halifax tonight. Tomorrow morning, they will sail for the St. Croix. And they'll be there in 24 hours. He put together what he called the Halifax Field Force. The Halifax Field Force consisted of an infantry battalion, the 17th Regiment, 70 gunners, 70 engineers, a commissary, and a medical unit. 1,000 soldiers. Remember, Gordon had asked for 50 to 100. And sure enough, the Halifax Fleet Frontier Force sailed up into the St. Croix River as he promised. Common sense said that you'd take this force and sail it into St. Andrews Harbor and offload at the wharf. No, Doyle understood gunboat diplomacy as well as hope. He sailed it up the river, past Navy Island, and parked it off Joe's Point. Pam? Joe's Point is right across the river from Robinson. Joe's Point is now part of Algonquin Golf Course. And there he offloaded his 1,000 soldiers, formed them up, and paraded them into towns with flags flying, drums beating, and bands playing, under the watchful eye of everyone in Robinson, and in particular, the Fenians who were standing there. And they paraded into town where they were greeted by a formal salute by the local Class A militia. Pam? I haven't got anything up there, Pam, yet. Yeah, there we are. And this is a Class A militia unit in St. Andrews, the Gordon Rifles, who greeted the Halifax Frontier Force when they arrived. It meant then, 3 weeks after Gordon had made his request to the imperial government, the military situation along the Maine-New Brunswick border had changed dramatically. The Royal Navy dominated the Fundy. The British were now in a position either to overawe the Fenians and prevent them from coming, or if they did come, it would be a bloody battle. The Fenians began to vote with their feet. They began to desert regularly, every day, slowly. There were still lots of interesting events occurred along the border that we could talk about. But it meant that slowly the Fenians disappeared. Kilian was sacked and fired from the Fenian Brotherhood. O Mahoney was forced to resign, and slowly the Fenian Brotherhood disappeared. The Halifax Field Force left the area on the 15th of May, and they were replaced by the Volunteer Battalion from St. John. The Navy began to downsize, and slowly on the 15th of June, the St. John Volunteers went home. And by the 21st of June, every soldier in New Brunswick had stood down. The Fenian crisis was over. I should make it very clear, I've been talking about the O Mahoney Fenian Brotherhood. We still had the Robertsons men of action, and they were still active. In fact, 2 weeks later, they invaded Ontario, captured a fort, and fought a battle, and won. And the Fenian crisis in North America continued on for another 10 years, including invasions to both Quebec and Manitoba. And even Victorian BC were threatened by the Fenians later on. But here in New Brunswick, the Fenian crisis was over. An important legacy followed from this occasion, because at this time, British North America was going into a tremendous controversy over a subject that we called Confederation. The British imperial government wanted the colonies in British North America to combine and form a new country to be called Canada. Very controversial, because it meant that each of the colonies would have to give up some of its rights to the central government of Canada. Several conferences were held in Charlottetown, Quebec City, London. And so it was not an easy thing to sell. Queen Victoria herself wanted the Confederation. But anyway, the discussion was going on. So all this time, Confederation was a main issue to us living in British North America. It just so happened in June 1665, prior to the Fenians arriving, or the Fenian crisis starting, there was an election held in New Brunswick. And in that election, only one issue was discussed: Confederation. Should New Brunswick join the Confederation? Sir Samuel Tilley was the supporter for pro-Confederation, and a well-known, well-respected man who tromped around the province selling Confederation. His only drawback, as far as I could see, is he was president of the Temperance Society. His opponent was a man by the name of Alfred Smith. And Smith's platform was quite simple. New Brunswick at this particular time was our golden years. Our lumber trade was at its peak. The ship industry was at its best. Our farms were out of the pioneer stage and were producing. We had a balanced budget, and we even had money in the bank. And he pointed out that the other colonies, what became known as Ontario and Quebec, were bankrupt. They had overspent building railways and canals. They couldn't conduct any kind of business because there was conflict between the French and English. It was stalemated. And Smith simply said to New Brunswickers, "Do you really want to get involved with these turds?" The election was that Smith won a majority. And as soon as he became appointed premier, we backed out of the Confederation debate. Unfortunately for Smith, they knew what they were against, but they had no idea what they were for. Subjects like railway policy or reciprocity with the United States, they couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't rule, they couldn't govern. So Gordon was forced to call another election in June 1866. Same issue. Should New Brunswick join Confederation? But this time, defense was now a major issue. The Fenians had come along and, if I may use the local term, scared the bejesus out of us. We knew we could not defend ourselves with our big border, small population, and maybe Confederation was the answer. Tilley won that election, 60% of the vote, 33 seats against 8 for Smith. And we were back into the Confederation business. When Confederation occurred on the 1st of July, 1867, there were 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec in the middle, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Had New Brunswick not joined Confederation, Confederation would not have happened. If the Fenians had not come to New Brunswick would not have joined Confederation. So thanks to the Confederations, you folks have Canada as a neighbor. Thanks. Oh, maybe, Pam, I should go through. I talk about the British. Oh, here's an interesting picture. This is one of our favorite. During this crisis, I mentioned once that the Fenians raided Indian Island. In fact, they raided Indian Island 3 times. And we decided it was time to do something about defending it. So they took the schoolhouse. This is a schoolhouse. It was a brand new schoolhouse. It was never occupied. And they fortified it. They built a barrier around it, put a picket fence around it, blocked up some of the windows and put in gun ports and turned it into a fort. And this sketch or watercolor is excellent. If you look carefully, you'll find blue jackets amongst the military. In fact, it was originally built by the sailors, so it must have been done very early. But that's an example of one of the fortifications that was built during the Fenian crisis to protect Indian Island. Are any other ones there? Oh, Pam, what about the medal? Is there any other on that slide that I neglected to talk about? This shows, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm muted or not, but I'm having internet problems.
Don't we all?
The wind is blowing a gale here and it keeps, I don't know, that must be it.
Well, here's a picture of the Calais and St. Stephen, and you can see a bridge across the river. You see the river's fairly small. One of the interesting events that occurred during this time was that on either side of the bridge was a picket guard. One day, two men started walking across the bridge towards New Brunswick, and the sentry at the New Brunswick side refused them entry to Canada because they were recognized as Fenians. They had actually seen these guys parading with the Fenians, so they refused them entry. The border was still open at this time. And so the guys turned around, and before they turned, one guy whipped out a pistol and fired at the New Brunswick militiaman. He missed and dashed across the bridge and was arrested by the Americans. Gordon demanded that this man be turned over to New Brunswick to be charged with attempted murder. It got escalated from St. Stephen, Calais to Portland and Fredericton, and then it went to Washington and London. Then it got in hands of the lawyers, and the lawyers said, on which side of the bridge was a shot fired? Well, it turned out it was fired on the American side, so it ended up in the American court. But all those kinds of things I think are really fun. Next slide, Glenn. Have you got the medal? Yeah, Indian.
Oh, the medal.
At the end of the war, the troops, quite a bit later, in fact, any of New Brunswickers or British soldiers that served in this campaign were issued with this medal. And as you see, the bar says Fenian 1866. You can also find ribbons with Fenians 1872. But this is the medal that any soldier served in the Fenian crisis here would be awarded. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's some drawer in some place in Maine that you would find this medal, because a lot of New Brunswickers eventually ended up in Maine. But anyway.
You have a question in chat that says, can you tell us more about the second and third Indian Island raids?
The second one was really quite interesting. Again, I thought you folks would be pretty asleep by now. And there was a British consul by the name of Kerr in Eastport. And he was very useful to Gordon in providing him intelligence of what was going on. And he had a number of people that helped him get information. And one of them was a merchant by the name, living in Eastport by the name of Burns. And Burns came to Cars and said, the Fenians are on my case. And they're telling me they're going to burn down the bonded warehouse on Indian Island, and it's full of my goods. Kerr reported that to both the British Navy in the area and the Army, and they did nothing. That night, the Fenians came over and burnt down the warehouses. And who lost most? Poor old Burns. So it sort of indicates exactly what it must have been like to live in Eastport. You know, what do you do? Who do you side? What do you say? But Burns certainly paid the penalty for supporting the British. That was the second one. The third one, they came over one night, but by then we had occupied Marble Island, which is a small island off Indian Island. And they came with a boat, exchanged some gunfire, but they never landed. They went back to Eastport. So there was 3 raids on the island. Any other questions? I covered a lot of ground.
Bob, the other Bob
Okay.
added into the chat after the question was asked, the schoolhouse was still on Indian Island until the late 1900s, where it had been moved to the shore and used as a boathouse. No evidence of the fortification remains.
Oh, thanks. I didn't know that. Gary? Gary, you had a question? Any other questions? Gary, you had one.
Bob, remember when you came to Eastport and did this talk in person, maybe back in 2016?
Yeah.
There was a fellow from Campobello who brought his great-grandfather's medal.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people have showed them to me, and I've run across quite a number. Yeah.
Were there any casualties during the conflict?
Not a one. Not a one, other than pride. Most of them were quite humorous when you look back on it, but you got to remember how scared we were. You know, New Brunswickers were really terrified about this and what was going to happen, but no casualties.
Bob, another comment has been added on the chat. There are now 6 houses remaining on Indian Island, and Sharon Wolf, who has made the comment, now owns the house that was invaded by the Fenians in the first raid.
Okay. I think I spoke to that lady one time. Yeah.
And I'd like to say that I have a friend whose last name is Mahoney. And when I asked him about the pronunciation, because it's spelled H-O-N-E-Y, he said, oh, my grandfather dropped the ma because he didn't want to sound Irish.
Yeah, it's an interesting part of our time. And I'm sure there's lots of stories from Eastport, living in a town that was really taken over by the Fenians for a period of time. At first, the Eastporters welcomed them because there was a bit of a sense of revenge comes to mind, because during the American Civil War, we were less than civil to them and didn't support the fears of the people in Maine. And now we were very scared. But it certainly changed after the Fenians became to dominate the town and begin to skip out on hotel bills and things like that. And I think there's a lot of good stories there to be learned.
And Bob, I think I did meet you when you gave a talk in Eastport to the Genealogy Society, perhaps?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I do remember, yes.
Did I tell the same story, or did I get it all gummed up?
Oh, no, you got it right. Except for the 6 houses. And they're all owned by Americans now.
Yes. I've not been to the island.
You should. It's quite interesting.
And Bob talked about the legacy in New Brunswick of the Fenians, and for several years, once a summer, King's Landing would have fortifications against the Fenian rebellion or invasion, and armed patrols of the King's Landing militia would roam the roads of King's Landing, challenging anyone thought to be a Fenian.
Can anyone hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, a small point. Ronald Rees in St Andrews. It's a niggling point, but the fear of the Irish was as much the fear of a Catholic takeover as anything physical, because the number of Catholics in New Brunswick had increased greatly since the famine, and it was partly the fear of Catholicism, as much as a military threat, that drove the vote against independence and toward Confederation. But it's a small niggling point. You covered it wonderfully well.
Thank you for that.
That's a good point too, because that was a considerable concern to Gordon. How would the Irish population of New Brunswick react? And he was very nervous. He went around and preached that, yes, the Fenians were Irish, but not all the Irish were Fenian, despite what religion you were. And I looked very carefully to see where did anything happen. What I found absolutely nothing. There was a report, as I mentioned in one of the newspapers, the delegation of Fenians went from St. John to that first convention. One of O Mahoney's leaders was a man by the name of Simeon, and he claimed to have been born in New Brunswick. But I found very few cases where a New Brunswick Irish chap joined the Fenians. And if you look at the nominal rolls of the Home Guard or the Class A regiments, a lot of Irish names appear, but you don't know which side are they orange or green, or were they actually Irish. So I found that and besides that, both the Roman Catholic Church were against the Fenians. The bishop of Halifax wrote many letters against the Fenians. The priest in St. Andrews was totally against the Fenians. And then you had the man called D'Arcy McGee, who was an Irish journalist out of Quebec, adamantly against the Fenians. So there was no, as I could see, any New Brunswick Irish people siding with the Fenians. But it's a good question, a good point that you raise. You're quite right. The Burning Bush, which is the newspaper of the Orangemen, could find Fenians and Irish Catholics behind every bush.
Bob, there's another question in the chat, and there was also some comments which I'll relate after you answer this question. But Janet Driscoll would like to know, was there any know-nothings reaction?
I don't understand know-nothing.
I don't either, but it's capitalized as if it were a proper name.
I think it's like a America First type political party in the US.
Don't know about know-nothing, but what's the word that I'm looking for? There was a group of Americans very strong on believing that all of North America should be part of the United States. Gary, what's the word I'm looking for?
You're on a blank, sorry.
It's not manifest destiny.
That's what I'm going to talk about, manifest destiny. There was certainly a belief amongst a lot of Americans that manifest destiny, everybody should be part of. That's what God had decreed. And the Fenians' attempt to take over New Brunswick supported their ideas. The idea was that they would never, ever return having conquered British North America. They would never saw it going back to being British again. So manifest destiny was part of this movement of invading.
The other comments that have been added 5 minutes ago, Karen McGurk said to everyone, excellent lecture with the humor and fine details. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Pam. She's offline now. The next one comment is from Janet Driscoll, who said, I'm a fairly new member, but love this talk and the personal stories that go with it. And then the third comment was from Bob, the other Bob. At times of the Indian Island raids, there were around 75 people living on Indian Island, including a standing militia. And there's one more comment from the other Bob that says, nice presentation, Bob. Thank you.
And I should also thank the lady that sent me those letters, Pam.
That's Tess, if she's here.
Yeah, I'd like to thank her for those articles too. It's been fun.
Bob, was it much more violent in Ontario and New York?
Well, yes. It was after we stood down at the end of 21st of June, 31st of June, the Men of Action, that group, Robert's group, under fighting Joe Sweeney, crossed the Niagara River, captured Fort Erie, then fought a pitched battle against the Ontario militia at the Battle of Ridgeway and won. It took a while then, not very long, but eventually they fought a couple more skirmishes and the Fenians went back. In 1872, they attacked across the Quebec border, a battle of Trout River and the battle of Ridgeway, not Ridgeway, Eccles Hill. In both cases, men were killed. And one of the interesting things at the Eccles Hill battle, the sentry after the battle was over, a British sentry was standing on the battlefield and he saw a movement, challenged the movement and fired his rifle and killed an old lady who was gathering wood. And there's a little marker there. And Nancy and I a year ago spent a long time looking for this marker, but it is marked where this elderly lady was killed. So yes, there was action. They crossed the border in Manitoba. No, they were chased back fairly quickly. The interesting one that I found at Victoria, BC, was all uptight because they heard that Fenians were loading 2 ships in San Francisco to invade Victoria. And they demanded the Royal Navy come and protect them. Nothing ever happened. So the Fenian threat continued on for a considerable period of time. In Australia too, for example. Yeah. Does that answer?
Yes. This has been wonderful.
Well, I enjoy the questions. It keeps me on my toes.
Bob, we have 2 more comments in the chat. One is from someone I suspect you know. It says, it's from Kirsten Wilbur, and it says, "Great job, Dad. It was nice seeing yours and Nancy's faces." And then Gail asked, she missed an early part. Well, this was great. Can I somehow see the recording of the first 30 minutes? And we added that the recording of this session will be on YouTube as quickly as our logistician can load it. And she's happy about that. And then Gail said, "Fabulous, thanks." That's all the comments so far.
I should point out that my daughter lives in Alberta. So this program has gone afield.
Wonderful. The YouTube channel is Eastport, Maine BHS. Well, I think, are we done with the questions? Perhaps that wraps up tonight's episode. Bob, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mike, for stepping up. I really appreciate it. And everybody, next month is a departure for us. We're going to be having a lady come speak to us from Florida about a bunch of Union Civil War soldiers who lost their lives in the Battle of Olustee. And because some of them were Black, they never got the due that they deserve. And that's been her mission in life. So we'll see you in July, I hope, everybody. Good night.
Good night.